Okay, good afternoon. Happy New Year. Trust you all had a pleasant break. So this is the first of our workshops for research in our staff development series for this particular semester. And we're privileged to have our colleague, Ali, to talk about mediation mechanisms in research, unpuzzling the puzzle. Overview of the mediation and moderation relationships. And guess what? We're going to learn about boots and bootstrapping. Yes, right. And Ali's going to explain that to us. But last year, in my capacity as one of the facilitators for the research seminar, a student was using mediation in her thesis, and I had not undertaken it before, but I knew who to contact. And obviously it was our colleague Ali. So we're privileged for him that he's going to share this information with us. And before I came down here, I was talking to a colleague and I said to him, oh, what do you know about mediation and mediation relationships? And he says, not too much, but I want to learn. And then he said to me, I'm not a fan of mediation research. And I said to him, likewise.
Good afternoon, everyone. Please. All right, good afternoon, everyone. And those of you also watching us from online, also welcome to Macau Institute for Tourism Studies. Okay. Let's start. All right. In today's workshop, basically, I will be showing you mediation mechanism, and also I also added up moderation mechanisms. Well, this seminar might be useful if you are a new researcher, or also, as Professor Abt mentioned, maybe you already initiate some research or research idea, but you are not sure. I'm hoping that at the end of this seminar, you will have a different angle, and if you are a new researcher, maybe you may have some new ideas to generate. Okay. Yes, all right, it's working. Good. All right, today, in this workshop, I have 6 parts in my workshop, and the first part will be direct effect. First, I will explain the direct relationship, and then I will explain the mediation mechanisms. While I'm explaining the mediation mechanisms, as I'm going to explain, mediation mechanisms take place between independent and dependent variable. That is why it will be also important to mention our emotion and cognition mechanisms. And I will also talk about these factors. Then I will also explain the moderation mechanism. And I realized when I checked the literature, I realized that not many people are aware of the boundary conditions. Mostly people know it as mediated moderation or moderated mediation. I will explain that one and make it clear, hopefully. And then at the end, I will briefly show the measurement of mediation and moderation. It's not going to be hard statistic, it's going to be really soft. And I'm going to show with an example, with a sample data, and you will be able to download. At the end, I will provide the PDF version of the presentation, and if you are willing to download the related files, you can. Okay, moving on. I think first it will be useful to introduce our variables. As you see here, we have X, Y, M, and W. And if you have been reading articles, then you always come across X, Y, M, W. Before I introduce the variables, maybe it will be also useful to define what variable is. In social sciences, we pay attention to the cases. And when I say cases, this can be a person. This can be a group, sex, weight, and we try to understand the characteristics of cases, and the characteristics of cases are the variables. Let's start with the first one. The first one is the independent variable. By the way, when I start, let's assume that I have a rock in my hand, and I want to understand how does this rock behave. Of course, when I check it visually, I can understand the structure of the rock. But to understand what really is, this rock should interact with something. Let's say I can use some chemicals to understand how does it interact with. And when we do this, we use the dependent variable. Let's say the rock is our dependent variable, representing y. It's also known as the output variable. So that's this variable that I want to study. I want to see what happens to this rock. And this, to understand, I need to use independent variable, a variable that we manipulate. That means that's the variable, that's the stimuli I'm going to use and test on the rock. Let's say I use acid, and what happens? In social sciences, it's not different from this. We want to also understand human behavior the same way, and how human interact with different people, different occasions, or different places. And we have the we have another variable representing M, mediator, and mediator variables traditionally placed in between independent and dependent variable, and it's the link that explains the mechanism between independent and dependent variable. And if you have been checking the literature, mediation has different names. It's also known as indirect effect, intervening effect, or intermediate. And there is another third variable that known as the moderator. Unlike mediators, moderators do not directly influence the variables, but it influences the process. And at the moment, it may not make much sense, but this is an introductory part. Later, I'm going to highlight and present the characteristics of these variables. Okay, so these are our variables. Now, let's say you have an idea, or you want to generate a new idea, and you want to generate X and Y, independent and dependent variable. Especially if you are a new researcher, you may ask yourself, how am I going to identify which one is IV and which one is DV? Here, as an example, let's assume that the independent variable is salary and the dependent variable is your satisfaction. But let's say, for the sake of examples, you are not aware of this. You are trying to find out, how are you going to do this? Surely we can rely on the theories, and based on the theory, we can link these two factors. Or we can also use the common sense. All you need to do is asking yourself, which one do you think would influence the other in an ideal world? Let's say, if I get more salary, does this make me happy? I think yes. And if I go to my work satisfied, am I going to be promoted, or am I going to get more salary? I think no. So this way, we can also understand which one is independent and which one is dependent variable. And after we identify this, in any kind of research, first, maybe one of the most important things that the causality between the factors must be always maintained. And the relationship is not mostly the relationships we generate, mostly cause and effect. But apart from this, we can also use before and after, or input output. Maybe we are focusing on the process, or also what you do and what happens. We can also link the factors based on this logic. All right, let's say you want to generate a new idea. You want to choose independent variable and dependent variable. As a researcher, what we aim to understand human experiences and human behavior. So what exactly we do, we try to understand the variance. When I say variance, you may ask, okay, what does it mean? Variance means change. It means that when our subject has encounter with with a stimuli, what happens to the behavior? So basically, what we do, we measure the changes in the behavior. That's why we call it variance in the behavior. So when we link the factors, what we do is measuring the behavioral variance. Okay. Now, whenever we use, I started from the simple, then I will move on to mediation. This is called a total effect when we relate independent and dependent variable. Let's continue with salary and satisfaction. Let's say as an employer, I want to understand whether my employees are satisfied with their salary. Then I can distribute the questionnaire and have the results. Let's assume that they are satisfied. Okay, this is a novel attempt to understand, because understanding two factors is not that simple actually. But when we, relatively, when we use mediation, yes, it becomes maybe less important. Going back to our main topic, when we use merely independent and dependent variable, yes, we understand the relationship, and we may also understand the importance of the relationship. Let's say at the end of it, my salary, let's say, explains 42%. But what does this mean? It means that there are also other factors that influencing satisfaction. And when we use total effect, when we use one IV or DV, what happens is actually what we measure is stimulus and response. And when I say response, as you know, traditionally approach and avoidance. Let's say in this case, approach means revisit intention, or avoidance, quitting intention. As I said, it's a novel attempt to understand the relationship between IV and DV. However, this is nothing more than like stimuli and response, like action, reaction. This gives us only action, reaction. But as you all know, life is not that simple. It's not the only money satisfies us. There are other factors like our colleagues, distance, French benefits, the image of the organization. These are also playing significant role in satisfaction. So now moving on to mediation. When we have a mediation, it's representing with M, just a second. Yes, right here, we have the third variable in between. And what we do here as a role, mediation factor, mediation variable, explains us the mechanism, how independent and dependent variable are connected. And here, the reason is that when we make our test, we are not testing on a rock, we are testing human subjects. And as a human being, we have emotion and cognition. It means when we interact with the stimuli, something happens to us first, and then it turns into behavior. And when we use mediation mechanisms, especially if you want to take your research more mature level, then you may use mediation mechanism. In this way, not only your study explain the relationship between stimuli and response, but also organism. What happens to organism in detail, and how does it turn into behavior? Okay, 1 second, please. All right. And before I explain the characteristics of mediators, I think it will be also important to highlight that, as I said, we are not dealing with a rock, we are dealing with a human. And given that mediators are just in the middle, and as I said, it's the explanatory mechanism, it is also important to understand our attitudes, because that's directly related to our behavior. And going back to our previous example, the relationship between salary and satisfaction, I think it is also important to mention that salary is something instrumental. How about our factor, when we want to use a factor that is not instrumental? Let's assume that your company has CSR activities, helping local people, and you are working in this company and you see it, you perceive it. This is not simple. When you work in a, let's say, hotel, and you see that your company help local people and maybe, let's say, Turkish people, what you feel is the effect. And what you know about CSR or belief will be your cognition, and how you are going to act, whether you are going to attribute, how you are going to reciprocate, this is going to show your behavior. That's why it is important to understand these components, because when we choose a factor, it can be affect cognition or behavior to explain the outcome variable. Moving on, I'm going to give more information about the emotion and cognition, because when we relate mediators with dependent variable, we must understand the characteristics of mediation variables so that we can link them in a better way. Let's start with the emotions. Our emotions are instinctive. Our emotions are free from our reasoning and intuitive. You may always see someone like we also always say, like the person is emotional. To me, emotion means that is your unfiltered thoughts. That mostly explains the stimuli and response, because we don't think. To be happy, we don't think much. We just become happy, just like this. And I think it's also better to go in deeper. Our emotions has three key components. The first one is subjective. Our emotions are subjective. If you are happy and I'm happy for the same reason, maybe your happiness can be considered as cloud nine. While you are in cloud nine, maybe my happiness is relatively low, but I may still feel myself happy because it's highly subjective. Or when you have pain, no one can really understand your pain because that's your personal experience. Another important key aspect is that the emotions have physiological and behavioral response. When you feel angry, you feel it in your whole body. You may have headache, you may feel weird in your stomach or tense. It directly influences your physiology and also your behavior. Moving on, according to neuroanalogy, our emotion is nothing more than a response. It's an electric signal. So whenever we have the stimuli, basically, whatever you feel, anger, happiness, sadness, our body interpret this stimuli and manifest it this way. So our emotions are the manifestations of outside world. This is the way we interpret it by using our emotions. Surely this is not the only approach that we understand emotions. Emotions are complex, and from the evolutionary perspective, our emotions play a significant role to regulate our relationships, because when you see someone sad or happy, you can read the emotion, you can understand how the other party feels, and you can regulate the relationships. Apart from this, our emotions are complex. Of course, when someone is happy, it is easy to identify, or when someone is crying, you can understand the person is sad. But there are also complex emotions that it is hard to identify. Let's say regret. How are you going to find out if someone has regret? And the reason we need to understand these differences in emotion, because if the emotion is not so intense and you want to test on something strong, you're not going to have that. I will make my point in the following slides related to this. And the other thing, our emotions may accumulate. If you know the catharsis theory, sometimes what happens is that you may have negative emotions at work or in your daily life, and then once it's accumulated, it explodes just like a volcano. And in that case, what happens, we may also investigate and learn more about the extreme cases when people extremely state and present their emotions. Of course, in the practice, this may not be good, but in social sciences, This may allow us to explore the extreme behavior when people have intensive emotions. And you may also ask yourself, if you are a new researcher, which emotion I supposed to choose? Like, am I going to randomly choose? What am I going to do? Well, there is a seminal paper that you can use it initially. And the benefit of this, the benefit of the wheel of emotions, first, you do not skip any kind of emotions. You may consider in your conceptual model, which emotion you think it will be more important in that particular context. Second, based on your outcome variable, which emotion suits better? Because as you see, some of the emotions are intense, like rage, as you see, terror, right? These are, and also like disgust. Based on the purpose of your study, you can choose one of these, and if you choose intense emotion, then the dependent variable that you are going to choose must reflect something extreme, because you are trying to measure an extreme emotion, and your DV should also conceptually should reflect something important based on that emotion. Yes, this would be a good reference point. Okay, now cognition. Unlike emotion, our cognition represents our intellectual, it's related to our intellectual capability. Cognition means thinking, it means to know, or putting simply, being aware of what's going on in your environment. And as you see, for cognition, process is needed. Unlike emotion, like being happy, it takes a second. But for cognition, we need to analyze different stimuli. Okay. And for cognition, we need multiple events. The reason we need multiple events, we need a reference point. We need a chronological history. We need to put all evidence based on chronologically so that we can evaluate. So it's not momentary. It's, as I said, it's a process. And cognition is evidence-based. As I mentioned before in my previous slide, as you see, our attitudes constitute of affect, cognition, and behavior. And these are all interrelated. We cannot separate. It means that our emotion influences our cognition. Let's say when you are judging stranger versus one of your family members, our emotions influence our cognition. Despite there is this effect, in some cases, our brain cannot deny the objective data. Let's say your salary or promotion, regardless of your emotion, this is a fact. And therefore, most of the time, cognition occurs based on evidence. And cognition requires multiple information. Let's assume that we are going to shoot a target, and I am the first. Okay, I hope this one works. Yes. In my first shot, just like in this example, let's say I missed the bullseye and it's on the right side. Now, what would you say? Am I successful? Well, if you evaluate me based on a single shot, I am not. But then, as a scientist, we should also think this way. How about in my first shot, if I hit the bullseye, what were you going to think? So that means, regardless of where I hit, if I don't keep shooting, it is nothing more than a random result. And therefore, you must see my couple shots, then you can say, okay, this person is not missing. So you can predict the level. But with a single information, it doesn't work. Now, why am I showing you this? Because it is related to DV. Now, let's assume that as a dependent variable, you want to measure loyalty. Now, ask yourself, if you use an emotion as a mediator, what's going to happen? As you know, loyalty requires cognition. Each time, let's say you go to a hotel or restaurant, in your first time, second time, and third time, you evaluate, and you also evaluate your previous experiences and compare, and that's how you become loyal to a company or to a person. But if you use an emotion as a mediator, that will give you a snapshot. Maybe 2 hours later, the person is not thinking that way. Remember, this is instinctive. Maybe I'm not saying using emotion is wrong, but in order to justify, maybe I should use one more mediator that is cognitive. Let's say perceived service quality. Not only I use an emotion, but by using cognition, I can see how the subject's loyalty influenced, because service quality evaluation is based on multiple judgments. It's not only the product, also it is related to service scape and the behavior of the service provider. Okay. Another thing is to consider the theory of cognitive dissonance and theory of cognitive dissonance reduction. Theory of cognitive dissonance occurs when we receive contradictory information. And another thing, the reason I want to share this, when we have this dissonance, as a person, we want to reduce it because our brain works with consistency. For the sake of example, equity theory, according to Adams 1960 and 1965, we do care our inputs and outputs. And when these are not matched, we want to restore it. But in many occasions, we may not present the actual behavior. We may, instead of doing the behavior, we may reduce the behavior. You may consider this, let's say you want to lose weight and you are drinking a Coke and you know that it contains too much sugar and you don't want to gain weight, but you still like Coke. So what are you going to do? You don't completely quit. Instead, you drink Diet Coke. So based on this example, when you are going to choose a dependent variable, I think it is also important to consider, okay, if my assumption is based on if everyone follows the mediation factor, but how about if everyone do not follow, but some people want to reduce? And in this way, as a researcher, I must ask myself, is there any substitute factor that is not influential as my main factor, but people are reducing? In this way, we may also reveal new research fields if we consider this way, hoping that it will be useful. Okay, now moving to mediation. Well, when we use a mediator, it is not a miracle. When you use it, it helps you to answer two things: why and how. Why is this happening and how is this happening? Of course, when we ask how, it means it focuses on the process. Similarly, mediators is the variable that trigger or activate the behavior. Let's say it may there is a moment that our attitude turns into a behavior, and that's what mediator is. It is the variable that turns or activates the behavior. Whenever you are, let's say, you are angry, and the moment that you turn your emotions into an action, it's done by the mediator. All right, and mediator also known as the link variable, because as I mentioned before, we have the stimulus and response relationship, but when we use mediators, it also shows us the organism, what happens to organism, and then how the organism responds. And given that mediators are just in between independent and dependent variable, methodologically and conceptually, mediators must have causal relationship with independent variable and also dependent variable. Therefore, in this case, symbolically, we can consider mediators as both chicken and the egg, because you can use it both as an independent variable and also dependent variable. All right, and just as I mentioned, mediators are the key factors, key variable that determines the behavior. And I think it is also important to consider when we are going to generate an idea. Okay, when I choose the mediator, am I going to pick one factor or more factors? Because if I pick one factor, I will only confirm the relationship. But if I use more than one, I can also see a pattern when people have alternative way in which path they will go. So my suggestion would be, when you use a mediator, maybe one of the factors would be positive and the other one is negative. Let's say one of them is loyalty, and you may also check negative word of mouth, because if people are loyal, then they shouldn't have negative word of mouth. So the other dependent variable that you use is going to confirm the effect of the other variable, not only confirm the relationship. Okay, moving on. Selecting a mediator. All right, let's assume that we want to choose a mediator. No matter what we do, there has to be a contribution, right? Our study should have a contribution. And when we choose a mediator, I think it will be useful to ask ourselves, am I going to use a new factor? Like, is my mediator used before? Has anyone used it before? If not, just because it hasn't been used, does this mean important? Or maybe it's not important, that's why no one cares. First, that's what we need to understand. If it's an isolated area, is it really isolated, or is it just not really important for many? I think that's one of the things we need to decide. Another thing is the theory. Maybe I'm still going to use, let's say, commitment. I'm going to use commitment, but then I may check the relationship with a different theory. And that will contribute, because each theory make prediction on the DV in a different way. And therefore, by using a different theory on a same mediator, we may still reveal something new. Or we may use a new method. This is something rare. We may use a new method to have more precise results. So when you start, I think it is a must to consider, where does it fit? Am I presenting a new factor, new theory, or new methodology when I use a mediator? Now I will continue providing you an option. What you see here is the method of choosing the mediators. I checked the literature. I believe this is quite useful. So based on the literature, we can say that we have two options when we are going to use the mediators. If there is an extensive literature regarding to our topic, then we can easily generate our hypothesis based on existing evidence. We can use the existing theories. So that does the job. Or the second option, if we see that there is no literature, in this case, maybe it's an unexplored area, and we find it out that it's important. In this case, we may use qualitative method. We may interview. Once you interview with people, unconsciously, they will start telling you the mediation mechanisms. Like, oh, it hurt my trust. Oh, or now my commitment changed. And another benefit of this, in some cases, during your interviews, you may also reveal potential moderators. If more people point out, you may also find out under what conditions that the mediation mechanism gets stronger or get weaker. Okay. All right. When we have the relationship, when we, in this section, mostly I'm going to show you some example studies, hoping that it will provide a different angle. All right. So we may have the overall factor. The reason I call it overall factors, sometimes the factor that we want to use, it must be a single factor, that it has no it may not have subdimensions. But this one has. So in this case, as you know, we have different types of commitment. So what I can do, either I can use all different types of commitment and analyze my data together. In this case, I measure commitment as a mediator. That's one option. I can go this way. Or we may have 3 or 4, we may have multiple mediators. In this case, let's say we may check commitment, job crafting, or trust. Of course, at the moment, the factors that I put here is all random. The association must be done based on the theory. The link between independent and dependent variable must be supported with a theory, and the same way with the DV and the mediator. Alternatively, what we can do is we can check the subdimensions. Going back to my commitment example, let's say if I use commitment, overall commitment, I may understand whether my employees are committed or not, but it's not going to, again, give me the whole picture. Let's assume that as a company, I arrange a weekend party, and I want to understand the satisfaction level of my employees or the participation level. If you use the overall factor as a mediator, what you are going to get is the commitment. But people may join to that party for different reasons. They may join because they like it. They may join because others join it, or they may join because they don't want to lose their job. Because if you don't go to party, maybe it's not going to look good. So mediators allow us to understand the mechanism in detail. So we can really understand what mechanisms trigger. As a company owner, I think you may really want to know which one really triggers, hoping that it is affective commitment, right? If you find out that your employees joining to that session because they don't want to lose their job, that means the meaning changes, right? The meaning changes. Okay, and not only that, as you know, we have different level of analysis. We have individual level, it represents the dyadic relationships, and we have group level, so it represents the team interaction. And we have also the firm level. In the firm level, it's mostly related to profitability. And now I'm going to show you a sample study. Yeah, it's my study, recently published. It's about the servant leadership and interpersonal citizenship behavior. As you see in this model, the mediator is job crafting. And the reason I'm showing you this, as I mentioned before, instead of using single DV, I use 3 DV, because here, it's not only the mediation mechanism. By the way, as you know, job crafting means how you customize your task by yourself. When employee, basically this model suggests that servant leadership exerts effect on interpersonal citizenship behavior through employee job crafting. And by using multiple DV, not only we confirm the influence, but which way will be significant and which path will be stronger than the others. Another example would be, this is also rare, that's why I'm showing, checking the dual path theory. In this case, what we do, we may use different mediators, but we can check based on the theory which path people going to go. Let's say in this example, as you see, corporate social responsibility influences, again, service-oriented citizenship behavior. But here we have 2 different types of mediator, employee job crafting and employee volunteering. Now, the tricky part in this model is that, as you know, job crafting is customizing your work. And imagine now, as an employee, when you see your company helping local people, now how do you attribute this? When you see your company doing extra effort, it's not obligatory, would you also do? Would you reciprocate? If yes, If yes, in order to craft your job, you need time and resources. But to be volunteer, you need to be outside of the organization. So this means that both leads you a non-obligatory result, but job crafting is still self-oriented, but employee volunteering is still more discretionary, because you are one side, either you are helping yourself to help others, or you are directly helping others. So the question is, which way people would choose? Based on a theory, we can also present dual path. That is also, I mean, this is just one more angle to consider. It's not the whole story, of course. Okay, moving on. Now, when we generate our hypothesis, when we generate the relationship between X and Y, what we assume, everything is going to be the same. Everything is going to remain the same, right? But in reality, it doesn't. In reality, what we have always the contingencies. There are certain things that we cannot predict. Let's say a year ago, and just like the butterfly effect, if it's coming, just like the butterfly effect, when there is a small changes in one factor, it may create big changes in the long run. And this is really unpredictable. At this moment, who predicted COVID-19, let's say, before? We didn't know that, but there are always contingencies. You may also consider this every day when you want to go to work. There is a certain time or an average time, let's say 10 to 15 minutes. But there are also contingencies, like when it's rainy, it changes. The time that you are going to arrive, it's going to change. Or when there is a road construction, or there is an accident. So now I'm actually talking about the moderators. Moderators literally, and you can see also visually, either strengthen or weaken the relationship, literally. It's either weaken or strengthen the relationship. It doesn't exert direct impact on the variable. It has a direct impact on the process. I'm going to show. You may also consider this, let's say this is your path. You are going to go straight, or we may also consider this the relationship between X and Y. Let's assume that, for the sake of example, let's assume the relationship between you and your partner. You have an average relationship that you influence each other, right? We call it average relationship. But in some cases, your relationships in some period, it may get stronger or it may get weaker. Let's say last week it was the Valentine's Day. How was your relationship? Was it same, worse, and hopefully better? That this is, to me, moderation is like a carousel. You still go forward, but in some cases, you know, you get higher or you get lower. This is what moderation is. So, or if I need to give another example, let's say at the weekend you visit your mother-in-law, and on the way back you see that your wife is not happy. Well, maybe your mother-in-law has no direct effect on your relationship, but it can really moderate the day. That means it may really weaken your average relationship for that day. All right. And moderation also tells us under what condition, when our outcome may change. Let's say when you have limited time versus your regular time. When we have limited time, it's not going to change what you are going to do, but it's going to change how you are going to do. And that's why we use moderator variables. When we talk about moderation, it's not only about the situation. Moderation factor might be related to a psychological phenomena, that it may strengthen or weaken the psychological analysis. Let's say it may strengthen your trust. It may strengthen your commitment, or that psychological process as well, not the situation. All right. Now, showing this visually. So as you see, we have the direct impact from X to the Y. And as you see, the impact here is on, it's not an impact, it's impact on the process, as you see, and it is strengthen the relationship. So it's not direct relationship what we are measuring. Visually, I think it is hoping that it will be easier to understand, I weaken relationship as well. By the way, if you check the literature, you will also see that moderators not only strengthen or weaken the relationship, in rare cases, it may also turn the relationship over. Like it may also eliminate or change the direction of the relationship. Let's say, if the mom goes forward more. Okay. Now, moderators are important for us, and there are several reasons for this. First, of course, the importance is the theoretical, because by using moderators, we can understand, we can show more complex conceptual model, and it may provide detailed information about the phenomenon. And the second thing, individuals are not the same, especially groups. When we consider moderators, we need to think about different groups, like different age groups. This can be gender or ethnicity, different cultures. When you collect the data and you ask specific questions, based on the area that you are going to ask, it may vary. And you need to consider this variable not as mediators, you need to consider as moderators. Another issue is the generalizability of our study. Under what conditions my results are valid, because moderators may change my results. In this way, I can also understand. Or we can directly use it to test a new theory, just like mediators. Just like mediators, I can use a new theory to test the moderator. And lastly, hoping that your study will have also some implications. Whatever you find, it can help managers, because they will also know under what conditions the associated relationship reaches the strongest part and the weakest part. Thank you. Okay, let's continue. Okay. After I show you the characteristics of mediators and moderators, I think it will be also useful to provide the distinction between these two, the characteristics. One of the main difference, I think the analogy of mediator we can think of, is mediators are just like the dominoes. That it means that when it gets the effect, it transmits to the DV. Okay. And also Collins directly stated in his article this relationship. However, moderators, as an analogy, moderator is like a dimmer switch. It strengthens or weakens the relationship this way. So as I said, one of them transmits the effect, but the other one gets stronger. Of course, there are other distinctions. I checked the literature, after I checked several articles, I combine some of the important distinctions. There can be more than what I'm about to show. But hoping that these distinctions will help when you conduct a research. First thing first, we can see that the function in a causal relationship, the mediators are linked and provide us causal effect, but moderators moderate the relationship, strengthen or weaken the relationship. Similarly, the types of questions we ask also matter. When we use a mediator, we ask how and why, but when we use a moderator like whom or when my results are valid or when my results get stronger. Similarly, nature of the variable. When we use a mediator is a state, so it can change, but the moderators are traits, so it is more stable. It is more stable. I'm not saying it is impossible, but it is more stable, like your character, personality. These are more stable things rather than your mood. Okay, and when to model it? If we are going to use mediation when we have causal effect, but for moderators, as I said, it doesn't influence the IV or DV, it influences the process, and therefore we may not have a causal relationship. Moving on, mediators have dual role. As I explained before, it's like the chicken and the egg itself. So it can serve as both independent and dependent variable. But moderators has only one role. They are the dependent variables. Another thing, the important one, yes, I think this is also important. Mediators should correlate with the other factors. But for moderators, we do not look for high correlation. And one of the things that I think we all need to think about it, when we decide our moderator, we must ensure that there is no high correlation. Because if there is if you are using similar factors, of course there are going to be high correlation. And putting simply, whatever you put there, you may have moderation, but is it going to really reflect the reality of life? Well, it may not. That is why we need to be careful when we choose the moderator. We must ensure that it's not really highly correlating with the DV. And lastly, degree of control. Mediators, mostly we manipulate because we want to see what's going to happen to the outcome behavior. But for the moderation, we mostly observe. Okay, it's sometimes not working. Okay, another thing that to mention about the moderators, I realized that. By the way, I have been also reviewing papers to different journals, and when I receive papers, sometimes I see that the authors use a new moderator. When you use a new moderator, it's the same thing, just like the mediator. Is it a new factor? Is it a new theory? Or is it a new measurement? And most of the time, people do not state the characteristics of the moderators. Besides, based on John's conceptualization, I believe this article is really useful. Before you generate your factors, it definitely will be useful to have a look. So based on this conceptualization, moderators, we have two types of moderators, omnibus context and discrete context. Omnibus context is representing the general environment, that it has influenced everyone. Let's say COVID-19 has influence on everyone. You cannot escape, or maybe this can be also economic crisis. But we have also discrete environment. It is maybe related to your supervisor. You work in the front line, and that's why you may interact with customer and you may have problems with the customer. So that is related to your task. And also the social environment and the physical environment you share will moderate the process. As you see, we also ask different questions like who, and this is the moment that when you are going to decide, let's say you choose your independent variable, mediator, and dependent variable, it's time to ask who plays a key role in this equation, who can change the outcome, or where can I get different outcomes, or when, like when we have COVID, how does it influence or why? Apart from this conceptualization, I'm going to show you another study, and it is the similar of John's conceptualization. I think this might be also good because it's an integrated version of what I'm showing you. Now, this figure shows the integrative framework linking context to leadership. On the right side, what you see is the relationship between the leader and the subordinate. So from the leadership perspective, you see the leader's behavior, the followers, and the dyadic relationships matters for them. And as an outcome, it influences employees' effectiveness, cognition, attitude, and behavior. However, this relationship, given that both parties work and share in the same environment, both factors influence from the environmental factors together. And as you see, this is omnibus context. It influences everyone. Where, who, when. Influences discrete context. Let's say the people you work because of your task. Let's say you may not know some people in the organization because you don't have joint task. Or it may, or the other thing would be, yeah, the physical, let's say where you work, is it a luxury place or is it smelly, sting? It also influences the way you are going to do your job. And overall, and also we have also temporal, like time pressure, just as I mentioned, it's not going to directly affect this relationship, but it's going to change the process. Okay? Okay, so moving on. So now, after mentioning this, we have mediators and we can have moderator. As you can see, given that we have moderators, I can place my moderator either between the mediator or just right after the mediator. And this is also known as, if you use your moderator before the mediator, it's called as moderated mediation. And if it is linked to your outcome variable, it's known as mediated moderation. But there is also one more thing that I believe many people miss, that is the boundary conditions. If you check the literature, you are going to see that moderation is actually a general term. And moderation represents both of these. And when you check the literature, you will also come across that when we use the moderator on the left side, we call it boundary condition, because the assumption is that this factor is going to influence the whole process. And again, this must come from the theory, because when maybe the moderator you use is not directly related to your mediator, but it's related to outcome. So if you are going to choose a boundary condition, please consider it must be a prerequisite. It must be precondition that influence the whole process. If not, it only covers, and we call it moderators. So I'm going to follow my presentation by assuming when I say moderator, so I'm referring to the right side, not to the left. I think this is also important to mention. And the other thing, as I said, if we are going to use mediated moderation, it means that the factor that I'm going to use has nothing to do with this part. It's not a prerequisite, but I want to understand in the final stage, how is it going to influence the outcome? That's we can also use this. Now, as you see in this example, servant leadership influences helping behavior through LMX, leader-member exchange, and also team-member exchange. These are the mechanisms that is presented. And as you see, as a boundary condition, the study suggested positive reciprocity belief. As you see here, we know that at the end of the day, every employee is going to respond to this. But based on, but certain group, a group that have positive reciprocity belief will strengthen this relationship. I hope it makes sense based on this assumption. Another example, this is another boundary condition. As you see here, servant leadership has an impact on OCB through, again, LMX and psychological empowerment. But as you see, this influence is going to be more influential when employees have proactive personality. Again, we are checking a certain type of group. Or we can associate on the right side. Okay, in this study, what you see is the influence of employee incivility on customer retaliation through psychological contract betrayal, sorry. And here we have the moral identity. As you see, moral identity may not matter here. It's not a boundary condition, but it's going to matter which path at the end people going to choose. And based on this idea, if your moral identity is high, you are going, people have tendency to choose vindictive complaining, because when your moral identity is high, you don't want to take revenge, you only want fairness. But if your moral identity is low, then either you go for third party, that means you can sue them, or you can use negative word of mouth. Conceptually, I think it is also important to highlight that when we check third party and negative word of mouth, these two, as a respondent, let's say, if I follow this path, I will damage the other party, but I will receive nothing. That's why this is a negative retaliation, but this one shows you that you are looking for solution, not only revenge. So it is related to your moral identity. Hoping that this example also trigger new ideas. Moving on, this is another example. As you see, as an IV, we have CEO servant leadership, and then influences firm performance, and the mediator is the service climate as a mechanism for service performance, and competitive intensity will moderate the performance. Like how many companies available there may change your firm performance. If you are the leading company versus high competition, yes, it may really influence your performance. Okay, combining all, I also would like to provide a suggestion, especially to new researchers. When you have an interest on certain topic, let's say job satisfaction, commitment, or it can be something else, my suggestion would be checking review papers. In the last 5 or 10 years, is there any review paper published? Especially if the review paper provides nomological network analysis, that will really save time for you, because here what you see, let's say this is the IV, and we can always see the antecedents, and here we can see the outcomes. As you see here in this article, the outcomes has been categorized as behavioral, attitudinal, leader-related, or performance outcomes. And we have also mediators here that is investigated investigated. As I said, when you check the nomological network, first, it directly shows you until now what has been done, what mediators has been used. So by looking at this as a researcher, you can say, okay, now I have the complete picture. I know what hasn't been done as well. So in this case, if you would like to use a new factor, you can use a nomological network analysis. And not only that, it also shows us the direction of the relationship. And surely this gives us not specific, but cumulative evaluation. What variables are associated? I think it can, as I said, it can really save time, and we may grasp the idea of the relevant literature when we check the review papers. Similarly, the nomological analysis generated by using the theories. Recently, I also wrote a review paper on servant leadership. Going back to this, as you see, this nomological network analysis shows the relationship among factors. But in this one, what I did the same thing with the theories. And if you look at the figure carefully, you are going to, I think it may get your attention that here, as you see here, this theory shows the firm level, and here mostly this part shows how servant leadership as an IV is measured, which theory has been used to measure servant leadership. And as you see here, social exchange theory and social identity theory predominantly used. Apart from this, I think the most interesting part here, as you see, in order to explain this relationship, most of the time, self-related theories were used, because when an employee interacts with a supervisor, how does it influence, remember, how does it influence the organism? And that is why, how does it influence the self-concept? And the right part shows you the outside of the company, and the evidence also shows that there can be sometimes spillover effect when when the employees influence, the influence not limited to organization, but it may also influence people's not only work life, but the family life as well. As I said, I think nomological analysis would be useful, and I'm going to show you one more nomological analysis about consumer engagement. Sorry, this one looks a bit smaller, but it is the same mentality based on the topic you choose. I think the first thing is checking the recent review papers would be a good kickoff. Okay, then let's directly now go to the analysis slowly. Now, when you check, now when we move on to the statistical part, it becomes more numeric. And when we use the numbers, we shouldn't forget that those are just numbers. But how about these numbers? Does it really reflect the reality? As I mentioned, I may use a moderator or mediator, but does it really reflect the reality? And the topics that you, if you are going to use mediation, as I said, it should highly correlate, but for moderators, we don't need that. Therefore, before you generate, you need to consider the theoretical soundness of the relationship. Okay, now calculation of the moderation. So how are we going to calculate this? I don't know how many of you have tried that before. Yes, it looks complicated in the beginning, but then once you do a couple times, then I think it will be easy. If you're, especially if you are new in this area, testing mediation, if you have a data that either it has been tested by someone else or you know the results, you can always check it out. So, according to Baron and Kenny's seminal article, 1986, if I'm not mistaken, we have 3 conditions to address in order to have a mediation. So the first, we must, independent variable and dependent variable must have significant relationship. So basically, we can test this by using linear regression. And the second condition, there has to be a significant relationship between IV and mediator. And lastly, we should also confirm the relationship between mediation and also dependent variable. Now is the tricky part. Given that now we are using mediation here, after we conduct our analysis, then we need to observe what happens to the direct effect. Because now we have another factor that is loaded to the equation. If we have a strong mediator, this load has to be shared by the new factor, or in some cases, it gets all the effect, then we lose the direct effect. If we lose the direct effect, we call it full mediation. Then it means that the direct effect is no longer exists between IV and DV. Or we may see that the influence of the direct effect may significantly reduce. In this case, we call it partial mediation. That's the difference between full mediation and partial mediation. Overall, if the influence is reduced, partial mediation, if we observe that the influence is disappeared, it means that we have fully mediated relationship. Moving on, when we want to test mediation, we may use different approaches. I am not going to go in detail, and also, by the way, I don't consider myself as an expert in mediation and moderation mechanisms. Every day I'm also learning something new. Every time you try, you fail, you learn. Okay, and in today's presentation, I'm going to highlight bootstrapping, which is recently become a common measurement method. So you may, of course, ask, what is bootstrapping? So what is bootstrapping is, I'm going to explain what bootstrapping is with this. Now, consider that, suppose that you have some paint. You have some paint. What you do based on bootstrapping is that let's say I get one spoon and put in another cup. Now, remember, in bootstrapping, the rationale here is that the software start treating our our sample as the whole population. And then suppose that I got one spoon here and put one spoon here. And from that, each time I put my spoon inside and take it. Suppose we have a soup inside. Each time I use the same spoon and I'm going to get the same thing, but each time when I get it, it will be different. It will not 100% exactly the same thing. That's probabilistically, that's not possible. And therefore, in bootstrapping, when we get different samples from the same population, do I get the same results? That's what bootstrapping does, simply. Okay. So now I'm going to continue my presentation by explaining a sample model. As you see in this model, we have conscientious behavior, overall health, overall physical health as a DV, and also mediator health-related behavior. The reason I have chosen this model is not directly related to my area, but the data is publicly available, and I also put it here. So I'm also going to provide the PDF version, and if you would like to download, you can download the data of this model. And if you are going to use mediation or moderation, you need to install process. And it's not difficult. You can directly download from this link, and the installation is pretty easy. You need to click utilities and install custom dialog. If you fail it, you can just check YouTube. It's pretty straightforward. It's pretty easy. Once you have done that, by the way, I am assuming that you are using regression model, and before you test mediation, you must check the linear relationship already, because if you don't have the linear regression confirmed, then there is no point to check the mediation. Okay, moving on. Now, after you install, you will be able to see on your menu, if you click Analyze Regression, then you are going to see a new menu item as Process. And once you click, you are going to have this menu in front of you. Okay, you may not know what to do. It's okay. So what you are going to do, all your factors are going to be placed in here. In the first step, you can place to your X. Maybe it's hard to see it, but if you are watching online, I think it is visible. So first you place your independent variable, and then you place your dependent variable. In the third step, then you place your mediator, and then you may also click the following. As you see here, there is one option that shows compare the indirect effect, model 4 and 6. As you see model 4 here, we also need to choose a model number. This means that when you are going to test mediation effect, we need to choose model number 4. In the following slides, I'm going to show you how you can download or how you can use other possible relationships. For mediation, that's it. Then once you hit the click, then you will have the output. I'm also going to show a sample output. But before that, if you also have a moderator, let's suppose you have a moderator, all you need to do is placing moderator variable here. As you see in SPSS, it shows SW, and that's why also in my presentation I used SW, because I just wanted to prevent confusion. Okay, so this one, as I said, this one shows us the mediation, and if you also have moderator, the only difference is you need to place it here. Okay, I recorded this from my phone. There is also a template that you can download. The benefit of this template is that maybe you have different idea, but then you don't know how to test it. The model number may vary, as you see here. Then based on different relationships, you may need to use different model number. Or my suggestion to you, if you have time, please download this template. Maybe as a researcher, you are not aware of that there are some relationships that we can actually use. That may also give us that, oh, okay, I never considered to relate my factors this way. And you may also see statistically which models, conceptual models are possible to test, because if it's not available, then you cannot go beyond. Okay, now moving on to our output. So I place it to our model here again, and once you click enter, you are going to see this output on SPSS process. On the left side, I indicated the name, like what is X, Y, M, and also here you can use it as reference. And now, how am I going to understand whether there is a mediation mechanism? The first number that I need to check is this one represents path A. As you see here, the power is 0.52, and the p-value is significant in 0.000 level. Then this means that the first part is confirmed. And remember, we still have 3 conditions, right? I mean, in total, we have 3 conditions. Now, let's check path B. Path B behaves, as you see, 0.38, and it is also significant. And then we have path C. It shows us here. But there is also one more thing, the total effect. It means that before we have the mediation, what was the original effect? That shows us that number. And that one, as you see, is 0.46. And now, how am I going to understand whether my results are significant? Surely, first we check the significance level, and then second, we need to check lower and upper levels of confidence interval. To do that, as you see here, we need to check the square. Look at these 2 numbers. As you see, the constant is, one of them is minus and one of them is not. If you have a significant result, 0 doesn't fall in between. So if one of them is negative and positive, you can directly tell that you don't have significant relationship. Either both must be here. I mean, I think it's easier to detect when both are positive or negative, you have significant results. It is same here as well. Now, as a summary, now let's overview. As you see that, I see that the path A is 0.52 and path B is 39. I just rounded up because it's close to the 0. And then what I see here, look, path C, before it was 0.47. It means that the total effect before it was 47. But now when I use the mediator, it has been reduced to 0.26. It's like 20 point something. So rounding up, we have 0.21 difference. So this shows us that we have partial mediation because we haven't lost the impact, but the impact has significantly reduced. And therefore, we can comfortably say that there is a partial mediation. Okay, and given that I mentioned moderation analysis, it is also similar. Again, you still need to check the same thing, but you have one more extra, output. But the interpretation is not different from that one. And you will be able to see when the standard deviation is low and when the standard deviation is high, what happens to the factor, you can see it. Well, if I need to revisit what I have done as a recap, as I mentioned before, it is a noble attempt to understand the relationship between independent and dependent variable. But if you want to identify more detailed relationships, definitely using mediation and moderation mechanisms will tell you more reality. It will reveal more than direct relationships. And I don't see any boundary as long as you use an appropriate theory it will definitely give you an interesting results. And as a final note, what I would suggest when you are going to generate a conceptual model, once you generate, you should be able not to predict the answer, like which path people will choose. It should be hard to tell. Then it's a really good conceptual model. Of course, you make prediction and you want to see whether those predictions going to measure and see whether significant, but surely try to generate a model that once you look at it, you cannot easily tell the results. And I think that brings me the end of my presentation. And if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer. Thank you very much for your patience, everyone.
Okay. Thank you very much.